Captain Jackson Hale was nervous, a rare emotion for him. He had been on countless missions across the galaxy, meeting aliens of all shapes, sizes, and cultures, but this was different. The Zelther were not just another species. They were a symbol of humanity's growing influence in the galaxy. Their beauty, intelligence, and power were unmatched, and Jackson was about to meet one of them face to face. As the Astrius descended toward the surface of the Zelther homeworld, Jackson sat in the command room, staring out at the planet below. Its surface shimmered with vast cities, floating above crystalline waters and lush landscapes. The ship's systems hummed quietly, and the crew prepared for landing, but Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was far more important than any he'd been on before. The Zelther had sent their invitation, their communication, their greeting. Yet it was Jackson they had chosen to represent Earth in the discussions. The captain knew he had to do well, but he had no idea how to prepare for a race whose beauty was almost mythical. As the landing gears touched down on the planet, the door to the airlock opened, and Jackson walked out. The air was crisp, and the land was vast and open, unlike anything he had ever seen. He was met by two Zelther diplomats who led him to the grand hall of their council. It was unlike any building on Earth, with silver flowing structures and a calm, peaceful atmosphere. Captain Hale, one of the Zelther, greeted him, his voice deep and resonant. "We are honored to have you among us." Jackson nodded, trying to maintain his composure. His heart was beating faster than usual, and he tried to focus on the task at hand. He couldn't let his nerves show. They walked through a grand corridor, the walls adorned with holographic art that seemed to move and shift with every step. Jackson tried to study the surroundings, but his mind kept drifting. Then they entered a large chamber where the Zelther High Council awaited him, and there she was, Ilaris. She stood at the center of the room, surrounded by her people, and as soon as Jackson's eyes met hers, his breath caught in his throat. She was stunning, even more so than he had imagined. Her silver-blue skin glowed with an almost ethereal light, and her features were sharp yet delicate, her face both alien and beautiful in a way that made it impossible to look away. Her long hair, like strands of shimmering silk, cascaded down her back, and her eyes, those eyes were deep and endless, as if they held the knowledge of the universe itself. Jackson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt dry, and his mouth refused to form the sentences he had rehearsed. He could feel his palms sweating, his usual calm demeanor slipping away. He wasn't just nervous, he was completely and utterly stunned. Ilaris, noticing his discomfort, raised an eyebrow slightly, and the corner of her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She had seen many humans before, but none had reacted to her presence in quite this way. Her people, the Zelther, were used to being admired for their beauty, but Jackson's reaction was different. It wasn't just the usual awe or admiration. There was something deeper, something almost vulnerable in the way he looked at her. She could sense his struggle, his difficulty in finding words, and it intrigued her. Jackson stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure of how to continue. His mind raced, but the words simply wouldn't come. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but it was no use. He had never felt this way before, not even when speaking to other species. It was as if the very presence of Ilaris had disarmed him, and all his training, all his years of diplomatic service, had failed him in an instant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to speak. His voice was unsteady, but the words came out. I am Captain Jackson Hale of Earth. It is an honor to meet you, Ilaris." The words were simple, but they were all he could manage. He cursed himself inwardly, frustrated at his lack of composure. This was not how he had planned it, but Ilaris only watched him with quiet interest, her gaze never leaving his face. "Captain Hale," she replied, her voice like music, soft, melodic, and warm. "It is an honor to meet you as well. Your kind is most interesting to us." Her words made Jackson feel even more uneasy. He couldn't tell if she was being polite or if she truly found humans intriguing. He had read about the Zelthers' advanced intellect and their highly refined culture, but standing in front of Alaris, he was beginning to realize just how much he had underestimated them. There was a long pause before anyone spoke again. Jackson tried to gather his thoughts, but all he could focus on was her. He could feel her presence like a force, steady and calm, yet powerful. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of his depth. I apologize for my silence, Jackson finally said, forcing himself to meet her gaze again. Your presence is overwhelming, it's just. I never expected to meet someone like you. Alaris tilted her head slightly, and Jackson noticed that she seemed to be studying him as well, not just as a diplomat, but as something more, perhaps something even personal. There was an intensity in her gaze that Jackson could not quite interpret, but he couldn't tear himself away from it. You need not apologize, Captain Hale, Alaris said, her tone soft and reassuring. I have encountered many who were speechless in my presence. Your reaction is not uncommon among your kind. Jackson's face flushed at her words. The embarrassment of being rendered speechless was not something he was accustomed to. But something in her expression made him feel at ease, as though she understood the struggle he was experiencing. Still, I am not like the others, he said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. I want to make sure that Earth and the Zelther have a successful future together. I want to represent my people well. Alaris nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as if considering his words. Your sincerity is clear, she said, and that is what matters most. Let us not dwell on first impressions, Captain. There is much to discuss. Jackson was relieved, but he couldn't help but feel a pull between them, something that went beyond diplomacy. It was a connection, something that reached beyond simple admiration. And as they continued with the discussions, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting, this encounter, was the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The days following the first meeting between Captain Jackson Hale and Alaris were filled with discussion, negotiations, and cultural exchanges. Jackson found himself completely immersed in the task at hand, trying to focus on his mission, but his thoughts often drifted back to Alaris. Her presence lingered in his mind, even when she wasn't around. The way she looked at him, the way her voice resonated in his ears, it was impossible to ignore. Alaris, on the other hand, maintained her composed exterior. She was a diplomat, a high-ranking member of the Zelther, trained to control her emotions and keep her thoughts private. But there was something about Jackson that intrigued her. His sincerity, his vulnerability, and his unguarded reaction to her beauty were unlike anything she had encountered before. Most humans were intimidated by her appearance, but Jackson seemed to be caught somewhere between awe and admiration, with a hint of something deeper, something that called to her. She had spent much of her life serving the Zelther in diplomatic roles, forging alliances and negotiating with other species. But this was different. With Jackson, she felt a connection, a sense of understanding that went beyond words or culture. She could see it in his eyes, the way he struggled to speak to her, the way his heart seemed to race whenever she entered the room. There was a raw honesty in his emotions that she found both fascinating and endearing. It wasn't long before Jackson began to notice that his interactions with Alaris were no longer just about the mission. He found himself thinking about her when he should have been focusing on other things. During meetings, he would catch glimpses of her, the way her hair shimmered in the light, the way her voice carried a softness that seemed to cut through the tension of their discussions. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was more than that. It was the way she made him feel, a sense of wonder and awe, but also a feeling of vulnerability that he hadn't experienced in years. One evening, after a long day of talks, Jackson found himself walking alone in the garden of the Zelther embassy. The air was cool and crisp, and the stars shone brightly overhead. The sounds of alien creatures calling out in the distance filled the air, creating a peaceful, almost serene atmosphere. Jackson leaned against a stone pillar, looking up at the sky. He was lost in thought, contemplating the events of the past few days, when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Alaris walking toward him, her presence as commanding as always. She wore a flowing robe of silver and blue, her long hair cascading down her back in soft waves. She looked every bit the part of a leader, yet there was something about her that seemed almost human. For a moment, Jackson wondered if it was just his imagination, but he quickly dismissed the thought. "Captain," she said softly, her voice carrying in the stillness of the night, "I thought I might find you here." Jackson straightened up, surprised that she had sought him out. He had expected their meeting to be strictly professional, as it had been for the past few days. "Alaris," he replied, his voice still carrying the same hint of nervousness that had marked their first encounter. "I didn't expect you to come out here." Alaris smiled, a small but genuine smile that softened her otherwise stern expression. "I wanted to speak with you, away from the formalities of our discussions. There are many things that need to be said, things that are not always easy to express in front of others." Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had sensed a growing tension between them, an unspoken connection that neither of them had acknowledged aloud. He knew that this was not just about politics or diplomacy anymore. There was something more, something deeper. "I've been thinking about our conversations," Alaris continued, her gaze fixed on him. "And about you. You are unlike the other humans I have met. There is something different about you." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. Her words were unexpected but not unwelcome. He had been trying to find the right words to say to her, but now he wasn't sure if he should speak at all. Instead, he simply looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face, on the way her features softened under the starlight. Alaris took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I sense a conflict in you, Captain," she said quietly. "You are torn between your duty to your people and something else, something more personal." Jackson swallowed, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. It was true. He had never felt more torn in his life. On one hand, he had a responsibility to Earth, to his crew, to the mission. But on the other hand, there was Alaris, a woman, an alien, who had somehow managed to touch his heart in ways he didn't understand. "I never expected to feel this way," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "When I first met you, all I could think about was the mission. But now it's different. I can't explain it, but every time I see you, it's like everything else fades away." Alaris studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "It is not uncommon for emotions to arise in situations like this," she said slowly. "But I do not wish for us to act out of impulse. Our people need this alliance, Captain. We must remain focused on that goal." Jackson nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He knew she was right. The alliance was important. It was crucial for the future of both Earth and the Zelther. But the connection between him and Alaris was undeniable, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. "I know," he said softly, "but it's hard, Alaris. It's hard to ignore how I feel when you're around." Alaris sighed, her gaze softening. "And yet we must," she replied, her voice carrying a tinge of sadness. "There is much at stake here, and I would not want my personal feelings to cloud my judgment. I do not want to make this more difficult than it already is." For a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the night. Jackson wanted to say something more, to reach out and close the distance between them, but he couldn't. They were both bound by duty, by the weight of their roles as representatives of their people. And yet, the pull between them was undeniable. "Perhaps it is better that we maintain our distance," Alaris said quietly, breaking the silence. "For now, at least." Jackson looked at her, his heart aching. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. "I understand," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But that doesn't change what I feel. Alaris nodded, her expression pained. No, it doesn't. And with that, they stood in silence, the distance between them growing once more. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment, they both understood that their connection was fragile. It was a bond that transcended politics and diplomacy, a bond that neither of them knew how to navigate. But one thing was certain, neither of them could forget it. As Jackson watched Alaris turn and walk away, his heart remained heavy with the unspoken words between them. He didn't know where this would lead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, this was only the beginning. The days continued to pass by in a blur of meetings, discussions, and diplomatic gestures. Jackson had always prided himself on being a focused, clear-headed officer, but since his arrival on the Zelther homeworld, he had felt distracted, unsettled. Every time he caught sight of Alaris, whether it was across a room or during their formal discussions, his thoughts scattered. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his emotions had started to crumble piece by piece. It had been several days since their last conversation in the garden. Jackson had tried to push his feelings aside, telling himself that it was just the intensity of the mission causing his heart to race whenever Alaris was near. He reminded himself constantly that the alliance was what truly mattered. Earth needed the Zelther's support, and that had to come first. But even as he repeated these words to himself, he couldn't shake the pull he felt toward her. Alaris was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her beauty was overwhelming, but it was her presence, her intelligence, and her quiet strength that truly captured him. There was something in her eyes that told him she was struggling with the same internal conflict. He wasn't the only one who felt something deeper between them, but neither of them had dared to speak about it. It was late one evening when Jackson found himself once again standing alone in the embassy's garden. He had been walking for hours, trying to clear his mind, but the peaceful surroundings only seemed to make his thoughts more chaotic. The garden was quiet, save for the soft hum of distant machinery and the occasional rustle of alien trees in the breeze. He had come to know this place well, even in the short time he had spent on the planet. It felt like a place of solitude, a place where he could think without the pressure of being watched. But tonight, as he walked along the stone path, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned and found Alaris approaching him once again, her expression calm yet purposeful. "Captain," she greeted him softly, her voice carrying through the cool evening air. "Alaris," Jackson replied, his heart skipping a beat at the sight of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, both unsure of what to say. The unspoken tension between them was palpable, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Alaris broke the silence first. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," she said, her voice hesitant. "I don't believe I was clear enough." Jackson didn't know what to say. His chest tightened at her words. Had she changed her mind? Was she going to tell him that the connection between them was nothing more than an illusion? The fear of rejection, though irrational, gripped him tightly. "I understand that this situation is difficult," Alaris continued, "for both of us. We are bound by our duties, and yet there is something between us that cannot be ignored. But I must be honest with you, Jackson. I don't know what to do with these feelings. I cannot allow myself to be distracted by emotions." Jackson swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of her words, the way they hung between them, but there was something else in her tone, something softer, more vulnerable than he had ever heard before. "I don't know what to do either," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending that this is just business. I feel something real, and I don't know how to ignore it anymore." Alaris's gaze softened, her usually stoic expression cracking just slightly. She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "I don't want to ignore it either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I must think of my people. The Zelther depend on me. The Alliance depends on me. I cannot let my emotions interfere with the future of my race." Jackson took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He understood the weight of her responsibilities, but the pull between them was undeniable. His thoughts raced as he tried to come up with a way to bridge the gap between their worlds. "I get it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "I understand what's at stake. I do. But that doesn't change what I feel. I've tried to keep my focus to push all of this aside. But every time I see you, every time I hear your voice, I feel like I'm losing control of everything else." Alaris's eyes flickered with emotion, and for a moment Jackson thought he saw a hint of sadness in them. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice raw with emotion. "But I cannot afford to give in to it. Not now. Not when everything depends on this alliance." The silence between them deepened, and Jackson could feel the weight of their unspoken words pressing down on them both. The tension was unbearable. He longed to take her hand, to pull her closer, to bridge the gap between their worlds. But he knew he couldn't. They both had duties, responsibilities that could not be ignored. "I'm not asking you to abandon your duty, Alaris," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not asking you to choose me over your people, but I can't pretend like I don't feel what I feel, and I can't deny the connection we share. Even if we can't be together, I need you to know that what we have, it's real." Alaris stood still, her gaze fixed on him. She was struggling, torn between her responsibilities and the feelings that had been growing inside her. It was clear to both of them that they were standing at a crossroads, and neither knew how to proceed. "I don't know what the future holds," Alaris finally said, her voice quiet and uncertain. "But I can't ignore this either, and I don't want to." Jackson felt a spark of hope at her words. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. There was a crack in the walls they had both built around their hearts, and for the first time it seemed like they might have a chance. "Then maybe we don't have to figure everything out right now," Jackson suggested. "Maybe we just need to take things one step at a time. We can't ignore what's between us, but we can also keep our focus on the mission. We don't have to let one thing destroy the other." Alaris nodded slowly, her gaze still locked with his. For the first time since their meeting, she seemed to relax just slightly. "One step at a time," she repeated, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Jackson felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't an answer, not a definitive one, but it was something. They had taken the first step toward understanding each other, and that was all he could ask for. As they stood there, the stars above them shining brightly, it felt like a weight had been lifted, if only for a moment. The future was still uncertain, but for now they had found common ground. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. A fragile beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And as the night stretched on, neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The connection between them was no longer a question. It was something they both felt, something they both understood. And for now, that was enough.